So some bits of Warhammer 40K rules are fairly straightforward, some bits are constant causes for confusion. Today let's take a focused look at 3 of the areas that tend to cause people the most strife. Are you playing them right or not? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd focus on a few areas of Warhammer 40k rules that seem to be the ones that cause the most issue for the most people out there. To ask some inspiration for a tactics video, a week or so back I did a community post asking which rules you guys out there understood the worst right now, and if there was one section of the Warhammer 40k core rules that you didn't understand, what was that section that was giving you the most trouble? I certainly had a few guesses for what might be most likely to come up, but voted to the top of the comment section out of that post. There are 3 very clear subjects, 2 areas of terrain rules in what blocks line of sight and what doesn't, particularly around ruins, what gets cover and when, and how the Paladin consolidation system works in the fight phase. It was kind of impressive that out of the people giving genuine answers to that, about 10 of the top 12 comments were in some form about one of those 3, each with a whole bunch of upvotes to emphasise that that was an issue. For this one then I thought we'd go through each of those in turn. I have mentioned them in previous explainer videos on the channel, so I thought for this one we could really focus on just those 3 things, rather than trying to recap literally all of terrain rules, or every single element of the charge and fight phase. Starting off, let's talk about the terrain things first, and it really does feel like one of the areas that maybe takes a little bit more of a learning curve for a whole bunch of different reasons. Firstly, it's maybe a little bit less intuitive than some things, as it tends to be a bit of an abstraction, and ultimately winds up doing a few things that weirdly don't feel like they make much intuitive sense with your models on the tabletop, just because the alternative is worse. Say things like not being able to draw lines of sight through obvious windows, and things counting as obscuring, because then if they don't, then you could equally draw your line of sight through 5 different windows across the map and make kind of ridiculous shots, or the idea that infantry can basically ghost through ruined walls, assuming that they're using doors and windows and things like that, whereas even smaller walls might be able to stop tanks and monsters in their tracks. On top of that, the benefit of cover plus the line of sight blocking things maybe aren't the most intuitive things in the world, and then all the rules actually have to be applied to people's real terrain sets, which might work better or worse with Warhammer 40k. In 10th edition, things tend to work best when you've got a base for the ruins, but not all pieces have. And partly as a result of that, and people not wanting to buy a whole new set of terrain every time that Warhammer changes an edition, those slightly suboptimal terrain pieces might be house ruled in all sorts of various different ways. Maybe things like ground floor ruins count as closed for tournaments, which is a common one. Or maybe players house ruling that their terrain pieces without a base count as having a footprint of one thing or another, which can get a bit messy if not everyone's on the same page. As a result, I feel like newer players often play a bit more by intuition on it, and might as a result often just let people take shots that they otherwise couldn't have had if you were playing it very strictly rules as written, or perhaps getting better movement and things. In any case, out of the 2 major things I wanted to talk about, in terms of the benefit of cover and what can see what through obscuring ruins, it's probably best to start with the basics. Before you've done anything fancy with terrain rules or anything like that, Warhammer just uses the true line of sight approach. So usually say if you've got a great big gun tank, and you're trying to draw a line of sight to these Infernus Marines, the one on the top left is fully visible, the one on the top right is visible, so you'd be able to shoot him, but at the same time he's behind a terrain piece, and that often means he'll get the benefit of cover to his save. The Space Marines on the bottom left are all fully visible, even if some of them might hide each other slightly. They're all within the same unit, so it all counts. And then on the bottom right, most of them are behind the wall and one of them's exposed. And for line of sight and shooting the unit, if you can see one of them, then effectively you can shoot at the unit, and that means that the entire unit can take casualties. Before talking about ruins and line of sight though, let's first talk about the benefit of cover. And this is basically a state that models do or don't get against any one shooting attack, usually handed out by their model being at least partially obscured behind a terrain piece of one sort or another, the exact specifics depending on the terrain piece, or potentially being entirely inside some area terrain pieces like ruins or woods, and some datasheets and detachments can just get it all the time. In general, 10th edition is considered fairly generous with giving out the benefit of cover to units out there, and the benefit is that when you're attacked, you basically improve your saving throws by 1, with the sole exception that it doesn't improve 3+ armor saves to 2+ ones against AP0 attacks. One very specific exception, and it stops things like say Space Marines or Sisters of Battle getting the single best mathematical advantage that cover could provide. In general though, it's usually well worth having, maybe more impactful for higher save things versus lower save things, but depending on what you're attacked with, it can still be very good. Looking at a simple example, here we have a Chaos Space Marine Havoc trying to shoot some intercessors, and unfortunately for him there's a wall in the way, that grey line representing a wall that he can't see through, so he won't be able to see the intercessors on the other side. When determining when the individual models in the Space Marine unit get cover against his attacks, the Havoc can draw line of sight to any point on his model, including his base, and then his aim is to be able to completely see each Space Marine completely fully exposed. If he's able to do that, then they won't be able to get cover, but if at least one bit of them is partly hidden behind that wall, they'll be able to gain that benefit of cover and the +1 save against, say, his crack missiles with AP2. For that reason, the one that he completely can't see behind the wall gets cover on the right. The one that he can partially see will get cover because there's still part of him that he can't draw a line of sight to. But the one on the left is completely in the open and he won't be able to get his save improved. It means that it's probably in the Space Marine player's interest to take the saves on one of the ones on the right first, as they're going to get better saves against the shooting attacks than the one that's exposed. If, say, the Havoc causes 5 wounds on the Space Marine squad, he'd have to slowly roll the dice and just do them 2 at a time, just in case the first 2 Space Marines died immediately, as the subsequent ones would have to be taken on the one that's out of cover and would get the worst saving throw, so you can't just roll them all together just in case you basically gained a whole bunch of improved saving throws that you shouldn't have been able to have. For certain area terrain pieces, like as we mentioned ruins basically being the most common, you can also gain the benefit of cover for each model wholly within the footprint. Here basically we've got a ruin with 2 walls behind the Space Marines, and then the ruin's terrain footprint being the lighter grey square here. In this one basically we've got 2 Space Marines standing outside of it, one that's partially over the base, and then 2 that are fully within the base, and all of them absolutely 100% fully visible to the Havoc in this case. Again, the benefit of cover is determined on a per model basis, so basically the 2 on the right are wholly within the base, the one that's partially within is not wholly within, so he doesn't get it, and nor do the other 2 completely out in the open. Again, if he caused a whole bunch of wounds, you'd have to roll them slowly if you wanted to take advantage of the improved saves on the Space Marines on the right in case they died immediately. Moving on, and in my opinion getting a little bit less intuitive now. Now we have an entire squad of Havocs firing at these Space Marines. When an entire multi-model squad shoots at the Space Marines, each of those Marines will now gain cover if they can't be fully seen by literally every single model in the firing unit. So if you want to deny the enemy cover, your squad's only going to be able to do that if the weakest link is in a good place still. It means that basically in this example, the 3 Space Marines at the back will all gain the benefit of cover due to that Havoc on the right that can only partially see the one on the top left. And the only one that won't get the benefit of cover in this case will be the one that's out towards the front, as every single one of the Havocs can see that guy no problem. Again, perhaps less intuitively still, if there's one guy that just completely can't see the Space Marines because he's entirely behind a wall, that'll mean that the squad that you're firing at will all basically get the benefit of cover, essentially even if they're completely out in the open against the remaining models that are firing. That one does feel a bit weird to me if the models aren't shooting, though I think it's done by Games Workshop to avoid the scenario where you might have 20 different models firing in a unit and they all might have different combos of the enemy unit getting cover or not getting cover against their shooting. And compared with the fairly blanket, generous approach that they have here, that one will be far more horrendous to resolve properly. In general though, due to the way that cover works for those, it usually is just a fair bit harder to get cover from big vehicles versus big squads. I say this Predator tank only needs 1 line of sight to each Marine rather than 1 drawn from each model in a squad. It means this Chaos Predator is only going to give cover to 1 Space Marine that it can partially see, as you can't fully see that one even if you draw its line of sight from the back track or something. Again, it's definitely a weirdness of 40k rules that you're drawing lines of sight from the absolute extremities of tanks and things. I feel like I don't personally mind this one quite so much myself. I prefer to think of it as the tank's position is maybe a bit more of a representation of roughly where it is, and you could imagine it backing up and moving forward to gain firing lines and things. And basically having the firing condition of it can see or it can't see is at least a bit more easy to do for quality of life if you're checking line of sight and things. That's just my general feel on it though. The same is kind of true in reverse as well. Individual really big monsters and vehicles can find it incredibly easy to get a cover save in 10th edition rules. They just literally need to make sure they obscure a small part of their miniature behind something as they move up the board. And their miniature does include the base of it as well, so you could even just have a partially obstructed view of the base and they could be claiming cover, or something as tiny as the tip of a talon of a Screamer Killer. Again, it's maybe a slightly weirdly generous rule for this one. I guess headcanon, I suppose you could again say that they're moving around and taking cover as they move up. That kind of feels like what they're going for. That's the broad strokes of the benefit of cover though. Basically, if your model's at least partially obscured from at least 1 model in the enemy firing unit, then they'll gain the benefit of cover from a whole bunch of terrain pieces. On top of that, there are a few more specific things. Craters and rubble basically only give infantry cover if they're wholly on top of it, but don't do the same to beasts or swarms for example for some reason. Battlefield debris and statuary and things work in the same way as those walls that we were talking about earlier. Basically, if any part of the model is partially obscured, they'll grant a cover save. So potentially occasionally means that they can cast a fairly long shadow back, even if your unit isn't necessarily right next to it, provided its line of sight is being blocked by the statue. You might still be able to get cover on some things. It's basically the same for hills, industrial structures, armoured containers and sealed buildings. The only difference between these is that you can put models on top of them, but you don't necessarily get any sort of cover save by being on top of them, only if you're partially obscured by them, so more needing to be behind the terrain feature most of the time. And then for the benefit of cover purposes, barricades and fuel pipes, again, are a bit more limited like the rubble and craters, mainly helping out infantry, and with the additional stipulation that they have to be wholly within 3 inches of them to gain the benefit of cover. Finally, we've got woods. Again, they provide the sort of area terrain effect. If people are wholly within it, then they get the benefit of cover. And also, if the only reason that you can see the models is by drawing a line of sight through the woods, then they also kind of cast a shadow that means that anything behind them gets the benefit of cover as well, even if they don't directly block line of sight in the same way that ruins do. It maybe does depend a bit as to what terrain you actually regularly use in game. Lots of tables tend to go really quite heavy on the ruins at the moment, so you might not need to worry as much about these very specific types unless they're actually regularly cropping up on games that you're playing. Talking of ruins though, let's move on to the second subject. When playing around with ruins, what gets line of sight in Warhammer 40k and what counts as being obscured. As mentioned earlier with determining visibility as well, is that as well as all the criteria to do with ruins themselves, the models do still need to actually be able to draw physical line of sight from one point to another, otherwise they can't see. So any terrain piece could block line of sight if it's physically big enough and there aren't any gaps in it, but then ruins have their special way in which they do so as well. Here's the basic rules section for ruins. In 10th edition they generally tend to work best if they've got a footprint. Very easy for ruins that have got bases or you've got some sort of base plate type thing to show the outline of where they're supposed to be. Though if they don't, you probably need to agree that with your opponent when you're talking over terrain at the start of the battlefield. Besides that, as we talked about, they can provide the benefit of cover, and they do so in 2 different ways. That area terrain thing where you have models wholly within the ruin, or if any enemy models are partially obscured from sight, as per those walls earlier. Both of those can be ways in which they can confer the benefit of cover. For movement rules, infantry and beast models can basically ghost through ruin walls as if they weren't there when they're moving around. They just can't finish a move as if they were warped halfway through a wall or anything like that, as that's not physically possible with the miniatures. And if you're very high up in a ruin, you might occasionally be able to get plunging fire if you're shooting at things down below. Besides all that though, it's mainly the visibility rules that I wanted to focus on, where basically the restriction is that as per a ruined terrain piece, if you're outside of that terrain piece, then you basically can't see over or through it, but you can see the things inside it, provided you can get a line of sight to them of course. That applies to everything besides aircraft, and towering get one other benefit where they can basically tow in and get good line of sight, as we'll talk about in a second. Just to illustrate the basics though, here we have a Chaos Havoc taking aim at a few different intercessor squads. Here we've got 3 Space Marines within the area terrain footprint of the ruin, and those walls are going to be walls with windows in it, and you can draw physical line of sight through them, so it's just the visibility rules that are getting in the way. Basically it means that the Havoc will be able to shoot at the Space Marines that he's got full visibility to in the ruin as they're inside it, but he wouldn't be able to draw a line of sight over the footprint of the ruin, so wouldn't be able to see the Space Marines at A or B. That's because he's outside the ruins and the Space Marines are outside it, so you're basically having to draw the line of sight over or through the ruin, and therefore they're obscured. I feel like for the ones where you're actually drawing a line of sight through walls, it maybe feels a little bit more intuitive, even if there are some holes in the walls and things, but it can sometimes feel a bit weird for say the Havoc targeting the Space Marines at A. In this case they're actually all completely fully visible to him as there's no walls in the way, but because the base of the ruin extends out that far in a great big corner, that still blocks line of sight. On the other hand, if the Havoc had a position entirely within the ruin, then that now means that he can basically see out of it. Because he's wholly within the terrain footprint, he can now see both the Space Marines at A and B, as he's no longer trying to fire both in one side and out the other. Games Workshop also have their own diagrams to illustrate as well, which are probably better than mine to be fair. Here we have the Space Marine repulsor tank, which is outside a bunch of ruins. In the first image it obviously can see and be seen by the termagants that are completely out of cover. It's still got a line of sight to the termagants that are sheltering in the ruin as there's holes in the walls and things, so it can see and be seen by them. But then the termagants up at the top at A, they can neither see the repulsor nor be seen by it, as neither model is within the footprint. It means that often if you want to hide squads and units behind ruins, they actually need to be behind the footprint of the ruin, at least to take advantage of the obscuring type rules, unless the ruins walls are physically line of sight blocking enough to hide your squad, which they often are to be fair. Then in the second picture on the right, that repulsor is now entirely within the confines of the ruin, so it can see all those 3 squads and they can see it. The single weirdest interaction out of all of this though, I think the one that trips most people up, it's what happens if your vehicles and things just tow into ruins but don't get wholly within. Basically, according to Games Workshop's style of play, they aren't really very generous to big vehicles like this. Say if we now have the repulsor half in and half out of the ruin. Basically, it gets the worst of both worlds to units that are the other side of it. It can be seen by them as it's entered the terrain footprint, but because it's not wholly within, it's not able to actually see them itself. So you can't just nose the corner of your tank into a ruin and then draw lines of sight out to the other side. Given that the insides of ruins tend to be at least kind of close confines and you might not be able to physically fit your tanks there, it often means to gain lines of sight, tanks often wind up having to go around the edges of ruins and then say get a corner round or something so they can see the termagants on the other side rather than trying to go through or nose into cover. This is definitely one that I've seen played wrong quite a lot of times, and I feel like it might at least partly be due to different sized ruin bases that people might have. Say for example, if you've got really quite a small ruin base, no tank's ever going to actually be able to fit into it. And people often intuitively play it, if the tank can get at least partly in, then they can fire out, but that's not technically the case. Part of the reason why that isn't the case is because that's now what the towering keyword does, and that's literally the only effect of it. If say instead of a repulsor, it was instead a great big Imperial Knight Castellan nosing into that ruin with the corner of its base, the towering keyword means that you don't have your line of sight blocked to the other side in the same way. So if he puts the corner of his base into a ruin, then he can see things over on the other side, making those towering units really quite effective, just for walking up to the edge of a ruin and essentially being able to see over it if you can get very slightly within the footprint. If the knight's completely outside of the ruin though and over on the other side, then they can still hide behind it and other things from them. They're treated just the same as any other unit in all cases besides them being just partly within. That was something that Games Workshop released in their initial rules pack and then errated quite quickly. Finally, for the other exception of ruins blocking line of sight, we've got aircraft. Provided they're not in hover mode, then basically they just ignore that entire visibility section of ruins. They're a specific exception. So if you say have a flyer zooming around that's arrived on turn 2 to do some shooting, if it can get physical line of sight to enemy units that are hiding behind a ruin, it can still fire at them. So it can mean that they might be able to shoot some unusual things on the board. But on the other hand, it does mean that they also can't hide themselves as well. So once they're arrived, enemy heavy guns aren't going to have too much problems in lighting them up. If the opponent does decide to put them into hover mode though and have them starting on the board and their movement being 20 inches normally, then that doesn't apply, as they basically lose the aircraft keyword and all the associated rules. They just basically count as vehicles that are a bit faster. In general though, I feel like half the battle with ruins is to know how to apply those rules to the actual terrain set that you've got. If the ones that you're playing on don't have bases, then that's probably something that you need to talk through with your opponent at the start of the game. What bit will effectively counter the ruins base? Will it say be the square that the ruins terrain piece defines, or can just having like a 1-inch base all around the bit where the ruin contacts the floor? I've seen that done before. Or some other variant. Otherwise, if the ruins do have bases, as mentioned, usually they do count towards the area of the ruin that counts as obscuring, but it might be worth just making sure that the opponents are all on the same page about that. And sometimes it just might not be very appropriate to if you've got certain terrain pieces. Say for example, if your ruin has just got an absolutely enormous base, it just might not make practical sense to count that all as just one single ruin, as you might have kind of weird interactions going on. Otherwise, for other things to check about, whether or not certain small ruins would count for obscuring or not, I was certainly kind of surprised when certain small 2-inch high ruins did count as obscuring in recent tournament packs. I can see the mechanical sense for that, but it still feels just kind of ridiculous to have, say, a 2-inch high wall somehow obscuring an entire knight behind it. And also, talking of tournaments, if you're playing with terrain with windows in, are you doing any sort of counts enclosed for the ground floor? Quite a lot of people do like to do that, just to provide better line of sight blocking, and meaning that your units can actually take up a position within a ruin and remain hidden, as opposed to having to stand awkwardly behind it if they do want to hide. Again, just something that everyone needs to be on the same page about it, no matter which way you're playing it. Finally though, leaving terrain behind, let's move on to the third subject, and that's how piling and consolidation work in Warhammer 40k. I guess in terms of movement rules, they do feel like some of the smallest, most fiddly and most technical ones. Maybe not seen as enormously interesting if you're a new player getting into the game, more trying to get to grips with move, shoot and fight. I feel like in more casual play you often just see people just completely skipping this step altogether and just taking the amount of models in their unit and rolling all their attacks for them, never mind engagement range or anything like that. A lot of the time it might basically amount to the same thing, and I feel like these at least make a bit of sense for models trying to bunch up to each other and hit each other and only be able to smack things within arm's reach, plus can allow you to do a bit of reforming after some fights have happened, and perhaps moving on to an objective after you've destroyed a unit potentially. The actual moves themselves I feel are potentially a bit confusing, as they have a fairly set order of operations where you have to do one thing then the next, and the individual model moves have to go closer to other enemy individual models, and it's got different sort of restrictions to basically any other kind of moves you might do. First up, to be able to make piling and consolidation moves, your unit actually needs to have been able to activate in the fight phase, and basically if you activate, then you go through the entire fight sequence, which means you make your pile-in move, you then roll your attacks and deal your damage, and then you make your consolidate move, and only after all that's happened do you move on to the next unit. To be able to activate, your unit must either be in engagement range or have made a charge move in the previous charge phase. Engagement range is within 1 inch horizontally and 5 inches vertically, and most of the time your units will be within it if you've just made a charge move, as you actually needs to end a charge move in engagement range, but due to, say, maybe another one of your units fighting, you might have killed the squad that they were in close combat with, but the unit that did the charging might still be able to pile in if there's other suitable enemies within smacking distance. Going through the process, so when you activate your units, they'll be piling in, then making their attacks, then consolidating, so the first step is pile in. Pile-in is basically an optional small movement to get your squad better into combat, so likely more models in engagement range or more models within base of base so they can make their attacks and hit the enemy. It could be important for getting models towards objectives as well if you're fighting over one. If you don't want to, you don't have to do this. Maybe it might not make sense if, say, you do have models on an objective and piling in would take them off it, but for most units most of the time it does make sense to try and get the maximum amount of models fighting. As well as being eligible to fight in the first place, as we mentioned, you also can only make a pile-in move if your unit can end the movement within engagement range of the enemy unit and also within coherency. So say for example, if your unit made a charge move and then another unit swooped in and killed the enemy before you even got to activate, you could only pile in if it could get into engagement range with a different enemy unit. When you come to make pile-in moves, where you actually move each model one at a time, when you get to each model they can move up to 3 inches, and they must use that move to end closer to the closest enemy model, so you're looking at the individual miniature within, say, the thing that you're in close combat with, or it could potentially be a model in a different unit, and if it's possible to use the movement to get into base-to-base contact with the model, then you must also do that as well, and that usually means that the edge of the unit tends to fold into combat against each other, with more and more models in base contact, and then maybe the ones behind them fighting in a second rank. I feel like that's all a fair bit to talk through in theory, so here's one example of them. The Space Marine Intercessors have just made a successful charge move against these Termagants, and their charge move was enough that the first couple got into base-to-base contact, but the ones behind didn't manage to, so are laid out here. At the moment, those back three aren't eligible to fight, because they're not individually in engagement range within 1 inch of those Termagants, or in base-to-base contact with one of those first two Intercessors that's in base-to-base with a Termagant themselves. To try and get there, they've decided to pile in, each of those going up to 3 inches closer towards the nearest Termagant to them. The one at the top was able to get into base-to-base contact with one, so he had to, and the other two have used their movement to get into base with that Intercessor who's basing the first Termagant there, so basically the entire squad will now be able to fight against them. I guess that's a fairly simple example. Perhaps just to make things a little bit more complicated, here we have the same unit that's done the same charge against the Termagants, but now as well as the Termagants being there, there's also a Tyranid Hive Guard model that's really quite close to them. The way they're set out, the Space Marine at A basically has finished his charge move very near to that Hive Guard. He's had to end the charge at least 1 inch away from it, as the Space Marines only declared on the Termagant squad and not on the Hive Guard. Because the Hive Guard has wound up being the closest model, the Space Marine now has the option of, if he piles in, he'll have to pile into that one, or otherwise he could just choose not to make a pile-in move, even if the rest of the squad does. In this case, when that Intercessor squad was selected to fight, they decided to make pile-in moves to engage that Hive Guard. The first two move as normal as they did last time round. This time the one at A has had to move into base-to-base contact with it, and even though they didn't declare him as a charge target, they can still strike him. The one at A and the one who's based with him would also be able to hit the Hive Guard if he chose to. The downside of dragging him into combat, though, is that the Hive Guard is now able to hit the Space Marines back after they've done any of their damage. If they left him out of combat, then he wouldn't have been able to strike back, and that could be quite a big deal if you just randomly engaged something like a big fighty enemy melee unit. It might have been worth just staying out of combat if that was the case. In any case, after you've done those pile-in moves, you then do the fun bit, which is actually making your attacks. As mentioned, models within engagement range or in base contact with a friendly model within base, they're all the ones that can strike. So say for example, in this squad, which had just piled into the Termagants, all the Space Marines with ticks are eligible to do that, either within 1 inches or within base contact of a model that's in base. The ones with the crosses fulfill neither of those. Then you go through the normal damage process, selecting your weapons, rolling your attacks, opponents roll saves and remove models. and then immediately after that your unit may choose to consolidate if you want to, and then that's the fight process over for this unit. Making consolidate moves is also really quite similar to piling, though it does have a couple of differences. Essentially this one's a little follow-up style movement that happens after the units made their attacks, where some of the reasons that you might want to are to try and make sure that the enemy remains engaged in close combat, even if they've taken some casualties out the front, and try to pull their unit out of engagement range, maybe so they could shoot next turn or something. If you use the Consolidate to step up with that, there's a good chance they won't be able to do that. And say if your unit's just completely charged in and wiped out whatever they charged, you might also be able to use Consolidate to engage a different unit and annoy them by locking them up, or use it to move onto an objective. Again, like piling in though, it can have consequences. If you consolidate into an enemy unit that hasn't fought yet, they'll then be eligible to activate and hit you, and potentially deal damage and kill some of your troops that just consolidated into them. For the most part, the Consolidate rules are pretty similar to the pile-in ones. Each miniature moves up to 3 inches, they have to go closest to the closest model to them, and if they can get into base-to-base contact, then they must do so. And as an aside, if you're already in base-to-base contact with anything, you can neither pile in nor consolidate, as it's not possible to get any physically closer to those miniatures. Again, it's optional, so no one model has to move if you don't want to. But the main difference between piling and consolidate, besides it happening after the fight not before, is that you can also use consolidate to move on to objective markers. That's only an option if you can't consolidate to get into engagement range with any enemy unit. It's only if you've just wiped out an enemy unit, there's nothing else nearby, and making a 3-inch move could allow you to get within 3 inches of an objective marker, with each model having to have finished that consolidate move closer to that point. Basically, I'd see the objective option only as ever an option if there's basically no enemies anywhere within 4 inches of any of your models. Again, for an example kind of similar to earlier, here are some Space Marines that just piled into those termagants that we just had. The Space Marines deal their damage and kill 3 termagants. The Tyranid player decides to remove the ones at the front, and if he didn't consolidate, the one at the back might now be out of close combat and could move and act normally next turn. Instead of allowing that, the Space Marines consolidate to get into base-to-base contact with that termagant, and what's more, they even have the movement to be able to completely surround it, meaning that if it even wants to fall back next turn, it will now need to take a desperate escape test as it's surrounded on all sides. Otherwise, for a second example, the Space Marines just charged in, and this time they just literally kill every single termagant with some nice rolls, but they're still not quite on an objective marker, which is around 5 inches away. Because there's no other models within range, they're happy to use their consolidate move to basically be able to get in range of that objective marker, or the models move a bit closer to it, and the only restriction is that each individual model must move at least a little bit closer to the objective, so you can actually use the movement a little bit more freely, and maybe kind of circle around it a little bit if that might help you get into terrain and out of line of sight perhaps. Finally, just for one slightly more complex example, in this example the Space Marines charged against those termagants once more, this time killing 3 of them and leaving 1 alive who's in base contact with Marine A. For the Consolidate move, Marine A can't move at all as he is still in base contact, but the rest of the squad certainly can. The ones that are near the termagant would have to go into that one and get into base to base if they can. The order of which you move them could actually be kind of important there, as if you move one of them first, then the other ones wouldn't be able to get into base to base, so might have a little bit more freedom. The one at the bottom at B though, if he consolidates, he'd have to consolidate into the Hive Guard, if he can do so properly without breaking coherency. So either he could opt not to consolidate, or if he does consolidate, he'd go into that, and that means that essentially the Tyranid player would get a little bit of free damage in the fight phase against him, now that Hive Guard can activate and make some attacks in close combat. Even though the Space Marines really want to be on the objective in this case, they can't use the consolidate move, just to have all the Marines move onto the objective as an alternative, if there is a way to get them into base to base, that they might be able to get a little bit closer to the objective by ones consolidating towards that termagant at the top. Maybe that'll be enough movement when they're engaging him to also get within range of the objective, maybe not. In any case though, hopefully that's been a little bit of help for the piling and consolidating, ruined lines of sight and benefit of cover. I feel like they maybe are just slightly annoyingly obtuse topics, perhaps ones that you just gradually build up more of a general feel of them by having come back to them a fair few times in various different situations. In any case, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you feel like you usually play these right most of the time, or do bits get skipped or done differently? I look forward to hearing all your thoughts and ideas. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that link to the video description below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.